Miss Fraser-Butler, now our last witness for the day wishes to be known as Caroline.
Caroline, that's correct, sir.
Caroline, would you like to come forward, please?
Please state your full name.
Caroline Carberry.
Hold the book in your raised hand. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Caroline, you're a chartered accountant
I am, yes.
and you're married to Brian with a 14-year-old son.
That's correct, yes.
Brian has haemophilia A
Yes.
and he received a lot of factor product during the 1970s and the early 80s.
That's correct, yes.
Brian believed he contracted hepatitis C when he was about 12 or 13 because he suffered a bout of pancreatitis at that time.
That's correct, yes.
That would have been in about 1979 or 1980, but neither of you are entirely sure.
No.
It's your best guess.
Yes.
He was told about his infection in the 1990s.
Yes.
And you met Brian in 1997
I did, yes.
when you were 23 and he was 30.
That's correct.
What was Brian's health like in those early years?
Brian he was a strong man. He was happy-go-lucky, a wee glint in his eye, always one of the first to offer to help. He charmed me, and I fell for him, although whenever I was reading my statement back, I went, how did I actually end up with Brian? If you look at it in paper, he wouldn't be your first pick, but he charmed me, and we fell in love. But he would have been in pain with his joints through our early years together. I think once, whenever I was getting to know Brian, I asked him what it's like to be haemophiliac. He turned around and said to me, I wake up in the morning, I'm in pain. I go through the day, I'm in pain. At night, I'm in pain. And he says, but that will not, it's not who I am. I will not let my life be affected by this here condition. And he got up every day, and he was happy every day, and we had a very happy few years.
You were the main breadwinner in the family because of Brian's ill health.
Yes.
What was your understanding of the hepatitis C in those early days?
Brian obviously knew that he had hepatitis C, but he believed that he was one of the lucky ones because he didn't get HIV. He believed that it was a condition that you lived with. There was no cure for it. We weren't given much information on the effects of hepatitis C. In fact, I would say that we're very naive, ignorant of the condition. We were more worried about the haemophilia, and hepatitis C was just something that was in the background. Every now and again, he would get his liver count checked, but we never thought anything of it. We never assumed that it would affect his health in any way, except that it was always there and it was always being checked.
In 2011, Brian contracted TB.
Yes.
And you've described that there was life before TB and life after the TB.
That's correct.
Can you tell us a little bit of what life was like for you before TB? What did you enjoy doing? What was life in the Carberry household like?
Carberry household was a manic household like any household. We had a young son who was a very boisterous young child. We would have taken him to the play park, we would have left him at his granny's, socialised, went out, wouldn't have been able to do walks or anything like that there. That wasn't, Brian was never fit to do anything like that, but we would have went for drives and trips and just a general family with their ups and downs.
It's your belief that the hepatitis C contributed to Brian contracting the TB in 2011.
Yes.
Why is that?
How many people do you know has had TB in the past 10, 20 years? This suddenly came out of the blue. I must admit, I'll probably be a Google doctor, as now everything goes onto the internet. And the more I read up about TB, the more I realised that it was to do with a reduced immune system. If you had a reduced immune system, the likelihood of the TB becoming active increased substantially. So it was my belief that it definitely attributed to Brian getting the TB.
And can you tell us what happened in 2011?
Brian initially got ill in September, October time. We went to various specialists. It was more in his bowel. And we, initially the doctors thought it was Crohn's. He was put on steroids. Whenever you're with somebody, every day, I don't think you realise how ill they're getting. And it was whenever people were starting, who hadn't seen him in a while, noticed him, he was getting thinner, but he had good days, and I would go, look, he ate a whole yogurt today. You know, that was a good day. He couldn't eat, he was coughing, and that continued right through to May 2012. His health deteriorated. Nobody could understand what it was. They couldn't understand it. They did think it was Crohn's. And it wasn't until he became delirious. And I phoned the doctor and asked him if he could come out and see Brian. And it described Brian's symptoms, and the doctor said, I think I should get an ambulance. And he sent an ambulance down. Brian was brought up to the Ulster Hospital, admitted. And then the next day I was at work because visiting hours weren't until the afternoon, and I got a phone call to say, could you please come up? The consultant would like to speak to you. So whenever I went up, I was expecting a lot of things, but TB was not one of them. But she happened to be going past when they were looking at Brian's x-rays, and they thought he had pneumonia, and then they realised that he had tuberculosis. So
by then he was under 9 stone.
yes.
So he lost a huge amount of weight.
Huge amount of weight. Very weak, no energy. Yes, it was, before this, Brian was healthy as he can be, fit and able to do work around the house. But over that period, he just got sicker and sicker and sicker until he had no energy, and yes, he was becoming delirious.
And once he was in the hospital, once it was diagnosed, he was put on antibiotics.
Put on antibiotics. Because he had such a high level of TB throughout the body, they decided to, normally it's a course of 9 months, Brian was in it for 12 months. They were taking no chances. He, because we obviously were with Brian, we also had to be checked, which was very distressing. I came back that I had latent TB, which means that I had TB in my body, but my body was strong enough to cope with it, and they didn't think I needed treatment. Unfortunately, for a 7-year-old child, to diagnose TB is not as easy. So Peter was brought to the city hospital, where he had various injections. He had a MAN2 test, and the consultant said, if it comes up, bring him up within 48 hours. I didn't need to wait 48 hours. It came up within 24 hours. Peter was brought round to various doctors to show what a positive MAN2 test was like, because a lot of the doctors hadn't seen such a reaction. And the only other way to find out if it was active TB was to get a sample of his stomach acid first thing in the morning.
And that was incredibly unpleasant.
That was
he ended up on some medication.
Hideous. The nurses came in the morning, and we had to hold his hand and keep him calm. And tubes were forced in through his nose, and if they couldn't get it through his nose, if he pulled his hands up, they were forced in through his mouth. So yes, that was 3 days, 3 mornings that we had to go through that, and on the third morning, they couldn't get it because Peter was so distressed, and they came back and says, we really have to try again. The doctors really need this. So we did it, and the poor nurse says, it's not allowed, but I'm giving you a hug, and I'm giving your mummy a hug as well, because I think she deserves it. But Peter was putting strong pain medication for 3 months, and it was 3 months of complete nightmare trying to get the drugs into him. But we managed it. We got through that, and we thought, this is it. Everybody's getting better. Life's going to be good. And in August, I went out. We were supposed to be going out for both mine and Brian's birthday, and Brian wasn't feeling well. So myself and his stepfather went on down to the bar, and we came back home, and Brian wasn't there. I said, where's Brian? He had driven himself up to the Down Hospital without telling us. I got a phone call from a nurse to say that Brian was being ambulanced up to the Ulster Hospital as he had a perforated bowel due to the contamination and the TB. So he went through emergency surgery that night, recovered, but wasn't recovering as well as what they thought he should be. And a week later, he was brought back to surgery and given a double barrel, I can't remember now, a colostomy bag.
An ileostomy.
An ileostomy, yes. He had a colostomy bag put on him. So we had another few months of Brian being in hospital and being in and out of intensive care. And then during that time, they found out that the TB that had been latent in me became active. And I had to take off work, which worked out well because I was then able to look after Brian because he had just been released from hospital.
When he was released from hospital, what condition was Brian in physically?
He was very weak. He was trying to come to terms with what had happened to him. He was very depressed because he couldn't cope with the colostomy bag. It's not that he couldn't cope, he didn't want to cope with the colostomy bag. I know it kept him alive for a year. If it wasn't for that there, he might have been dead, but it brought him down. He became very angry. We had to be very quiet in the house because he got very tired very quickly, and if there was a lot of noise or Peter was being too boisterous, he would have started shouting, which wasn't Brian. That wasn't my husband. But he'd been going through so much. It took its toll out. He couldn't shout at anybody or say anything to anybody. But we were there. We were his closest people. And he's going to be angry. And the anger has to go somewhere. So it did sometimes come towards myself to make life easier. I tried to keep Peter at sports clubs, at different places, out of the house, just until he recovered. But it took a long time for him to recover from that process. So.
About a year later, the ileostomy was reversed.
Yes.
And at that point, you thought, we've got through it.
We've got through it. We've got through the worst time of our life, and we can get on with life, and we can get back to being our own family, our own close-knit unit again, and just put this all behind us. We breathed a sigh of relief, I think, is what you can say.
And then in 2014, Brian became aware of Harvoni. Can you tell us what happened?
2000 Harvoni, he went and asked if it was possible for him to get on to their treatment. And they turned around and says no, that it wouldn't be suitable. So he got, I think it was expensive. You had to go onto a waiting list. So I think it was, he got in touch with a local MP and he asked to be considered for it. And she petitioned on his behalf to get this drug. So he was accepted then to go on to it and to try and treat the hepatitis C. At that stage, he felt a lump on his neck. And whenever he felt the lump in his neck, he went up and saw Gary Benson, who's his haemophilia consultant. And Gary said that would get a needle biopsy. So we got the needle biopsy done, and it came back negative, that there was no cancer, nothing untoward. So we breathed a sigh of relief. But they decided that because the lump was so big that they would remove the actual node or whatever it was. Whenever they did that, it was sent to a lab. It was only after that somebody explained what a needle biopsy was like. They said it's like putting your hand in a hay bale, and you might get the bad bit or you might get a good bit. And whenever I look back now, I realise that they got a good bit. We were travelling home, and Brian got a phone call to say that Gary Benson would like to see him the next day, which was strange because we never got phone calls like that. But we weren't worried because the needle biopsy had come back clear. So I let Brian go up to see Gary. I went to work. And whenever I came home, he came in a bit shocked to say that he had been diagnosed with cancer. I must admit, it took us all, our breath, by surprise at the news.
And that was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
That's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, yes. Gary wanted to speak to Brian himself and wanted to inform Brian as quickly as possible about this here. He'd already been speaking to the cancer consultant, was able to tell him who his cancer consultant was. But it was the initial shock. We didn't know what to expect. We thought this was bad. We thought TB was bad. This was just as bad. But we went up. Brian got the treatment. He went on RCHOP and had 6 sessions of treatment.
And that's chemotherapy that
Yes.
went on for a period of 6 months.
6 months, yes. It was one treatment every 4 weeks, and his first treatment was the week before Christmas. So we weren't. It was not a great Christmas, but Brian was with us. He was still on the steroids. It was his first time of getting the treatment, and we didn't know what to expect. Thankfully, we got Christmas Day out of the way before we realised how people are affected whenever they come off steroids. The body just crashes. While he was on steroids, he could have done anything. Could have went up the mountain. But as soon as he got off the steroids, Brian's not one to stay in bed. It's not him. He's got his chair in the kitchen. And he sat in that chair, and for 2 days you couldn't speak to him. You couldn't say anything. He just went into a wee place on his own, and he said he just needed those 2 days to get over what had happened. Then the effects of the chemotherapy kicked in, and then he started recovering. Things got better again, in that it was coming up to the next cycle. So it was a repeat pattern. Everything repeated itself for 6 weeks. But by the end of it, we were experts. We knew when to get out of his way. We knew when to leave the house. We knew when he wanted somebody to speak to him and when he didn't want anybody to speak to him. But it was harsh. It was a long time.
You've been told that there is perhaps a connection between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and hepatitis C.
Yes, we were told that there. We were told that the immune system, yet again, the hepatitis C reduces your immune system, which non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is again based on that there's the link that your immune system decreases and gives you an increased risk of having cancer.
Once Brian went into remission
Yes.
with the lymphoma, he was then advised to start treatment for the hepatitis C.
Yes, he finished the treatment, and within a month he was started on the next treatment for the hepatitis C. It was over his 50th birthday, so we still had a party for him. He watched us all drink a bottle of champagne while he had his blackcurrant and lemonade. But we celebrated it. We got through and just made a mark of the occasion. We were celebrating that he was alive as well.
And that treatment of hepatitis C was successful. He's
It was.
cleared
It's
the virus,
indetectable.
that it's undetectable.
Undetectable.
But your sense is that his body's already been damaged.
It's been completely damaged. It's the fatigue that he goes through, the tiredness. Whenever he was first diagnosed with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and after getting through that process, something came up in his blood. There was a problem with the calcium in his blood. So he was sent to see a parathyroid specialist, and they diagnosed that there was a problem with one of his parathyroids. But they kept a close eye on Brian, and they kept checking him, and he was getting better. His hair grew back. He put weight back on. I think it was at that stage I says, right, enough. Step away from the table, put the knife and fork down. But he was looking better. He was feeling better in himself. Still very tired. His eyesight was very weak. Just his mobility had reduced again. Everything just seemed to he just seemed to get more unwell rather than, and I think that's the effects of the chemotherapy, and probably as he gets older, whether his body just can't fight as much as we did whenever he was young, and nothing would stop us then. But now we were lucky that they had such a close eye on him.
He went for a CT scan in February 2018 because of that parathyroid scan.
That's correct.
And what did they find?
The consultant saw something in the CT scan and contacted Dr. Sheehy and says, I think you should bring Brian back in. Something that showed up in the CT scan. So yet again, poor Brian went up to the appointment on his own, because I thought it was another, just a general review. And yet again, I came home from work, and Brian walked in through the door and went, it's back. And we stood and looked at each other. We had a wee bit of a cry, and then we went, right, what's going to happen now? Let's get our fighting heads together and let's go get through this process again. We've done it once, we can do it together again. We're Team Carberry.
And the thing you were facing next was ESAP chemotherapy. ESAP chemotherapy. And what does that entail?
It was the RCHOP chemotherapy was an afternoon, or well, you might as well say 1 day every 4 weeks. The ESAP, Brian went in on a Monday. They put a PICC line on him because of the severe amount of chemotherapy that he was going to have. They didn't want his veins to collapse, so they put a PICC line on him. And he was put in to the cancer hospital on a Monday morning, and 4 24-hour bags of chemotherapy was put through his body, and he was allowed to leave on a Friday. So he was in hospital and constantly getting fluids and chemotherapy. we were lucky if he got out on a Friday, but more than often it sometimes would run into the Saturday if the chemo wasn't prepared or wasn't ready. So yeah, I was working, left Brian in the hospital. Thankfully I had a very supportive employer who allowed me to be flexible and work, and I would have used my leave and went up at 2:00 and spent a couple of hours with Brian, and Peter would have went to my mum's house, and then I would have collected him whenever I came down. It was hard on Brian, but that was, I think he had 3 or 4, I can't remember, cycles of that. And they also suggested that for relapsed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that the best course of action was a stem cell transplant. So once he went into remission with the ESHAP, that was the next thing that we had to then get our head round. So we went to the city, and it's supposed to take a day. He had to inject himself in the stomach to get his stem cells moving out of the bone marrow. That was okay at the start, but like everything, towards the end, putting the needle into the stomach was very difficult for him. We went up to get the stem cells taken out, and he hadn't produced enough stem cells that we could do. And they realised that he needed blood, so we had a pint of blood while we were there. Then they gave him more injections and said come back the next day, and they were able to get some stem cells the next day. Then he had to stay overnight and get another injection, which was supposed to increase his stem cells. So thankfully by the Friday they had enough stem cells to carry forward in the process. But we had to wait. We didn't know when there would be a room available because he would have to go into hospital for 5 weeks at a time.
And when he was in hospital, when he was able to have the transplant, he had high-dose chemotherapy.
Yes.
And went into isolation.
Yes.
For 6 weeks.
That's correct.
You've said that, thankfully, at the beginning of the November in 2018, he was told the cancer was once again in remission.
That's correct. It was another happy occasion. I must admit the highs are very high and the lows are very low over the past few years. So this was a high. This was November. With the stem cell, you're not allowed out of the country for 6 months. So I had already started planning. Let's go on holiday. We'll start saving now, and that'll be us. We'll get away. We'll get a break. Get this year behind us again. But Brian, being Brian, was a stubborn fool. His body wasn't recovered, but Brian thought he knew best, as he often does. And 2 weeks later, after, I must add, I told him to go to the doctor and was told in no uncertain terms to keep my nose out of it. So by that Friday, I didn't listen to him anymore, and I phoned the cancer helpline, and they said bring him in immediately. And they did his observations whenever we went in, and the nurse looked and she turned around and she says, right, let's get the doctor here straight away.
And on the 23rd of November, he was readmitted to hospital with pneumonia.
Yes. I must admit, whenever I heard it was pneumonia, I didn't give him much sympathy. I must admit, as he was being wheeled to be admitted, I did turn around and told him so. Says, I shouldn't say this, Brian, but I told you so. And that was, he was wheeled in and he went up into the ward and he was admitted, and they put him on antibiotics. And whenever he was put on the antibiotics, he was also put in oxygen, but he wasn't recovering as well as what they thought he should, and they suggested that he goes down to intensive care. So he went down to intensive care where they had higher levels of oxygen, that they could provide him with the higher levels of oxygen. He was in there for 5 or 6 days, and then he was brought back up to the ward. Brian was getting very annoyed at being in hospital for so long and wanting out, as Brian does. He doesn't like to stay in them. He's been in them that much over the last few years. He decided, nope, I think I've had enough. I think I'll go home. And I was at work, and yet again I got a phone call from the nurse to say that something had happened to Brian. She didn't want to go into details. And says, could you come up immediately? Brian needs you, or Brian wants you up here. And says, the doctors are working on him. And it was only whenever I put the phone down, I went, what did they mean by the doctors are working on him? I think I was shocked. The ones around me at work were shocked. And I remember getting in the car and the tears starting. And they flowed from the minute I got in the car in Downpatrick until I got to the city hospital. And at that stage I says, calm yourself down. Brian needs you. You have to be the strong one. So I calmed myself down and I went in, and Gary Benson was in the ward, and he looked at me and he says, take a deep breath. He says, Brian's lung has collapsed. The lung specialists are in, they're putting a drain in, and said, go into the waiting room, and whenever they're finished, it says, I don't want to go into the room in case they're doing something, and I don't want to put them off in the process. So I went, that's fine. Within a minute, the nurse came in and says, no, Brian's waiting for you, he's waiting for you. So I went through, and there was people all around him, and they were putting the drain in. And he was panicking, but I went over and stood beside him and told him off. I said, what are you playing at now? Do you not know what I'm going through here? Enough of that. Behave yourself and let's get this here drain in. So he got the drain in. And yes, the ward that he was in had never dealt with a spontaneous lung collapse. So it was a new event for them up there. Whenever I spoke to Brian later, he turned around and he said it was overwhelming, that he felt nearly like he was drowning. And then all these faces came over and he started panicking. He didn't know the faces that were around him. So that's why he wanted me. Thankfully, I'm not very squeamish, and I have no problem going into a lot of places that maybe most people might not. Blood doesn't affect me, and maybe I've got a morbid view and just enjoy watching the process. But the drain going in, I would have, throughout Brian's conditions, last year I started taking pictures, because in various places that Brian was getting procedures done, he couldn't see. So in his neck, I would have taken a picture and then showed him that. And what started off as a picture for Brian to see, I've now got an album on my phone of chemo 1, chemo 2, hospital room 1, hospital room 2. I even sneaked an intensive care the first time that he was down. But he was panicking at that stage.
He ended up being in ICU, ventilated,
Yes.
sedated,
Yes.
and was in the ICU on the ventilator for 11 days.
We, whenever the lung collapsed, the haematology ward weren't sure how to deal with somebody with the lung problems that Brian had. The lung ward didn't know how to deal with Brian's haemophilia problems, so they decided to bring him down to the lung ward with the consultants coming down and floating down between the two. The next, I went home and phoned Brian to see how he was the next morning, and he turned around and says, I can't speak, I'm panicking. I went up straight away I didn't care about visiting hours or anything. I went straight away up to calm him down. And we calmed him down, and they decided that it would be best for him to go down to ICU again. However, they didn't want to give high pressure oxygen to somebody who had a collapsed lung, so that was a concern. But in the end, they thought that it was the best place for him to go. So he was brought down to ICU, and I went home. Peter was at home, our son, and I just lit the fire. I had gone for a shower, and I came out of the shower, and my son was standing there with the phone saying, "Daddy's on the phone, can you phone him back?" I says, "Right, okay." And I phoned him back, and he turned around and says, "They want to ventilate me. They want to put me under. I don't want them to do this." And he handed the phone to the doctor, and the doctor says, "I think you should come up." So that's exactly what I did. I just turned round after being up there all day, turned round and went back up. They also made another phone call whenever the intensive care said that they thought that the ventilation was the best. He says, "If you think so." And he got his phone out, and Gary Benson had once given him his mobile number, and he phoned Gary and says, "Gary, here you go," and give the phone to the doctor. Gary came in and I think met me in the intensive care, and we sat and we discussed what was best, and they said if Brian didn't become ventilated, that his body would start shutting down, and in a week's time it might be too late to ventilate him. So we decided to go along and get the ventilation done. So Gary stayed with me until they were happy that everything was okay, and they brought me in. And I've seen a lot of things with Brian, but I couldn't hold the tears back that day. They flowed. Seeing him in that state was difficult, but it was a means to an end, and we knew it was only a short period of time until his body recovered. I went home at 12 o'clock, and I woke up at 6, and I phoned, and no, it might have been 5, and I phoned the ward, and the nurse who was in charge of Brian says, "No, there's nothing to tell you, there's nothing to inform you, all's good." And I went, that's all I wanted to hear, all's good. So I managed to go back to sleep, and the next thing the phone went downstairs and went 7 o'clock in the morning. Nobody phones the house at 7 in the morning. And I went downstairs, and it was the ICU, or the intensive care doctor, saying, "I think you should come up here. Brian's taking a turn for the worst." So yet again, I jumped in my car. I'm not saying I might have done the legal speed limit on a Sunday morning. The tears started, and yet again got to the city hospital and went in, and he had a problem with his heart, but they had rectified it by the time that I got up. So went in, and they had to keep him sedated, because every time that they reduced the sedation, he would have went to try and grab the tube and bring the tube out. And towards the end, I would have been there from 8 o'clock in the morning. I would have got up early in the morning, missed the rush hour traffic, and I would have just sat with him. Sat reading my Kindle. Whether he wanted to or not, he listened to some chick flick books that I was reading to him. And every day I hoped that they were going to take the tubes out. And every day they turned around and says, "He's not ready yet, he's not ready yet."
And
And
after
then
11 days.
After 11 days, I was nearly going to take the tubes out myself. And I turned around. They tried at one stage, but he was delirious, and they had to put the tubes in again, because they were frightened that he would hurt himself or hurt somebody else. So they tried different drugs, and eventually they were able to take the tubes out. But he was very delirious. I thought that it would get better once he got the tubes out. But it's hard to describe somebody who is delirious, who's hallucinating. I can look back now and I can smile and I can laugh. I would go in and visit him and I would say, those nurses said they're making so much noise. I couldn't get a wink of sleep. They were out partying. They came in drunk. I said, I think you might be wrong, Brian. I said, the bands. Now I can laugh at it, but at the time I was, oh my God, what is happening? What is happening to my husband?
You've described it in your statement very well. You've said the pneumonia was a complete unknown. I was very frightened. I thought he was going to die. There seemed to be no way of controlling what was happening to Brian.
Yes.
And you say that was in real contrast to how you felt about the cancer.
The cancer is very different. The cancer, your hand is held. You have books, you have information sheets. Brian never read any. I read every single one. And they explain, this is going to happen. You're going to get the chemo. These are the reactions that you could have. This is the anti-sickness drug that will give you. In so many weeks, this is going to happen. In another few weeks, this will happen. So everything you knew were how long the process would take and how long it would take for them to get results out of it. With the pneumonia, it was a complete unknown. It was the first time that he'd ever missed Christmas, that he'd ever missed the New Year, which was difficult for our son, who is 14. He's never had his dad away for that length of time. In fact, it was whenever I told him that his dad was in hospital for pneumonia, he turned around and just says, how long for this time? It was like water off a duck's back at that stage. But whenever he started realising how serious it is, you could see him starting to go into himself. And it was in the middle of his exams. I know they're not important. Well, all exams are important as far as I'm concerned with Peter. And you can see whenever we were there, the grades were higher than whenever we weren't there to supervise him. So we know it did affect him. I know that I didn't get a Christmas list from Peter for a long time because he didn't know whether his daddy was going to come out, and he didn't want to ask for anything. We went up on Christmas Day. We gave him his presents. It's a Christmas I don't want to go through again. We want to have Christmas together. I think that knocked me. It wasn't a Merry Christmas, let's put it that way. And I think a few people would have got swung for if they said Happy New Year to me that year.
On the 3rd of January, Brian came home.
Yes.
But he was still really very weak.
Whenever I was speaking to Gary, Gary took me aside and said, I don't think Brian should go home. But at this stage, Brian, we're walking out of the hospital. He'd been in long enough. In his head, he could do everything. He could walk out of the hospital. He was going to do whatever he wanted to do. It was only whenever he got out to go to the bathroom that he fell, that he realised he had no strength. He had no energy. He needed the wee three-wheeler. Brian tries to be very proud, and as much as I tell him to use a stick because of his reduced mobility, he would never use it. But this was a means. He had to move. If he wanted out of the hospital, he wanted to get out. Gary says, if we don't let him out, though, he says, I don't want to let him out, but if we don't, he's going to lose faith in us. We've got a good relationship, and I don't want to lose faith, and I believe that he'll actually get worse if we keep him in hospital. So he said, as long as you're at home, we're happy to release him. So myself and Peter got to the bed because we're in a 2-story house and there's no way he would have got up the stairs. So we put a bed in the living room and Brian came home with his oxygen. He was very weak. The exercises that I made him do were basically getting from the chair to the table to eat and go back again. I said, I'm not handing things to you. You need to get stronger. He slept in the living room, and Brian, being Brian, hadn't had a shower in a long time. He decided, I think I'll have a shower. And I just thought, oh no, how are we going to get him up the stairs? So it was Operation Shower Brian. So Peter was at one stage, he was on call, I was there, and we had it planned down to when even we were going to do it. It was going to be in the morning after he'd rested, after he got up and had a cup of tea, and Peter was in front of him and I was behind him. And the whole expedition took us about an hour to 2.5 or an hour and a half to 2 hours. But we did it. And he got his shower, but it was very weak.
Initially, you thought that Brian was getting stronger and things were looking up.
Yes.
But unfortunately, you've now been told that the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma has returned.
Yes.
What does that mean you're now facing? If you'd rather...
I think it was a tough year last year. Very, very, very tough year last year. The treatment that he was given, we believed was going to cure him from the cancer. Brian had an appointment, and I wasn't going to go up with him. And he turned around to me and he said, I think my lumps are back. And I went, okay. And I checked, and the lumps were there. Brian was tired. It was about 8:30, 9 o'clock, and I sent him up the stairs to go to bed, and I straight on to Google, relapsed, and we stuck our head in the sand, and it took a month for it to be confirmed. I think this is the first time that we've actually had to wait for confirmation, because every other time has come as a shock. And we went up, and Dr. Sheehy advised us that it was back. And we laughed, and we joked about it. And then we went home, and at 5 o'clock the next morning, I reached over, turned my alarm off, and I just felt sick. And as hard as hearing that he has cancer back, telling our friends and family was, I think, extremely difficult. So we were advised that the treatment's going to be more difficult. There was less success rate. But there is still treatment, and he is still strong enough. Although we're tired, he's still strong enough to fight. And Dr. Sheehy mentioned, whenever she was speaking to me, says, have you been Googling? And I went, yes. And she said, have you ever come across CAR-T treatment? And I says, no, that's a new one. And she says, there's a new treatment available. It's not in Northern Ireland. It's over in England. And she was going to put Brian's name forward.
And so you're ready now to go to Newcastle upon Tyne for 5 weeks.
We got the news on the Tuesday, and on Friday got a phone call to say, can you go over to Newcastle for Monday morning? So we went to Newcastle on Monday, and they said that he was a perfect candidate for this treatment. They had to get approval for it because it is an expensive treatment, and he would be put before a board. So we didn't know if he was going to get onto it, but we got word then that he got onto the treatment. And we went over a few weeks ago, and the T cells were removed from his body. The T cells go to Amsterdam and then America for modification, and they're coming back, and they hope to be back for the 6th of June. And on the 6th of June, Brian will be admitted to the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle upon Tyne for 5 weeks. It'll be another difficult time, but we will get through.
Caroline, do you feel able to tell us what the impact of all this has been on you, or would you rather I read a couple of paragraphs from your witness statement?
Go ahead. I can't remember what I wrote.
It's just you captured it very well. I try my best, but it's a terrible struggle to cope. I've been on antidepressants for a year. It's only a mild dosage to take the edge off things, but I got to the stage where I needed something by way of support. I felt like I was left to look after Brian at home as he recovers without any kind of physical support, no counselling, no nothing. The years since 2011 have been a nightmare, and in the recent months that nightmare got worse. I seem to see my life in two parts, my life before 2011 and life afterwards. I have to be strong for Brian and our son, but it's a terrible struggle.
That would, yeah.
Can you tell us also what the impact has been on your son and
Peter,
on the family?
The family in general, we're a close-knit family. So it's not just Brian that's been affected by the hepatitis C. I've been affected. Peter's affected. Brian can't go. He can't stand the cold. He's missed out on so much of Peter's life. And Peter has missed out on having his dad there. From the age of 7 right up to now, Brian has been in and out of hospital numerous times. And he has a very close bond with Peter, and Peter with him. Is the two of them would gang up against me. So they would, if I go out for an evening, 9 times out of 10, Peter will be there beside his daddy, keeping his daddy company. If Brian goes out, Peter lives in his room. He's a typical teenager. Although since he's heard that the cancer's back, he suddenly decided to live with us again, so we actually see him other than feeding time. And he comes down and sits beside his daddy. I've been put to the other sofa. But it has affected his mother and my mother and all of our extended family. His mum can't cope with everything that Brian's gone through. She came down once whenever he was in the ICU and couldn't come back again. It was just too much to see her son in that there condition. We struggle. I'm trying to work as best I can. I managed it right through until January or December. And in December, I couldn't work. I couldn't concentrate. And I felt that I was letting Brian down by not being with Brian. And I was also letting my employer down, because if I work, I want to do my work at the best of my ability. And I just couldn't do the two. So I had to take off at that stage. And now that the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is back, I can't. I'm tired. That's the only way I can describe it. I just feel drained. I've reduced my hours at work. As I said, I can't go through all the hospital appointments with Brian, using only my annual leave. And my annual leave was completely used last year on holiday appointments. I'm going off in 5 weeks' time, and to do that, I don't want to let, again, the employer down. So I've been doing the overtime. I've been working bank holidays. I've been working as much weekends as possible to get jobs done before I go away. And I have to take unpaid leave for 5 weeks because the CAR-T treatment, they've advised us that there's a very high percentage chance that within the first few days, Brian will be back in ICU and could possibly be ventilated again. And it's a process we're not looking forward to. We're hanging on by our fingernails, but we'll get there.
Thank you. I want to ask you about something entirely different, which is the financial assistance.
Yes.
Brian has received payments from the Skipton Fund.
Correct, yes.
And now through the Northern Ireland Blood Payment Scheme.
Yes.
Do you have any comments you want to make about that?
I'm glad that he's got something. We were living on my wage for a very, very long time. We scrimped, we saved, we got through. We had no spare available cash, so whenever this money became available, it gave us a bit of breathing space. It's not, I know Brian's pretty cross that it's not the same as England. He believes that everyone should be treated equally, as do I. But it means that Brian doesn't feel guilty. It's given him his own independence, I would say. But it helps. I think that's all I can say on that.
Those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you would like to say?
Like everyone, I think I've scribbled down a few points. Firstly, I'd like to thank Sir Brian and the inquiry for coming to Belfast and giving us a chance to have a voice. Throughout this process, different people wanted different answers from the contaminated blood inquiry. I personally want the public to know what it's like to live with someone who has been infected by hepatitis C. Although the infection happened years ago, the repercussions and effects are here and now and in everyday life. Infected and affected families do not need sympathy. They need support, whether it be emotional, physical, and financial. Just because they look like they're strong and coping, please don't always think that this is the truth. I mentioned in my statement in January, our family's life over the last few years have been hell, but I'd like to update that statement. Our lives have been hell, are still hell, and for the considerable future will continue to be hell. No one knows what's going to happen. All I know that myself and my family have a difficult few months ahead of us. We can't plan anything. We've had so many times that our holidays have had to be cancelled. I pray and hope that Brian gets through this year and that he survives to find out how this inquiry ends. As much as I am his rock, he is mine, and I currently can't imagine my life without him. Thank you.
I think everyone will have been moved by your amazing strength in coming here to tell us as you have and showing us your positivity and practicality.
Thank you.
And so thank you from all of us.
Thank you very much.
The inquiry will take a break. We don't sit again. You'll understand, particularly after today, why it is that we don't sit every week. I think it will be difficult for all of us. But we will start again in London on the 4th of June. And after that, we go on to Leeds in the following 2 weeks. But can I just say this, that you have all here in Northern Ireland, our first trip outside London, you've been so very, very welcoming. Even the weather has been welcoming. And I can't really thank the weather. I don't think it would answer back. At least it promises not to answer back in the way I would like. But I can thank you, and I do. I don't know why you've all thanked us, really. It's nice to hear it. But it is actually what we're here for, and it seems to me to be absolutely right in principle that we should go around the UK. This is a UK-wide inquiry. And I think the value of coming here has been shown by the testimony which I've heard. It has been, I shall say no more than this, it has been immensely valuable to me, and I know that it has been valuable to the team who will have to present the evidence to me. If we have as much value from our other stops throughout the UK, we should be doing very well. Thank you. That's all that I have to say from now until the 4th of June. If you are in London, you are, of course, very welcome to come. But thank you for being here and making us so welcome.